practicing what you learn is paramount. I don't consider a topic really understood until I've actually built something with it. But how do you come up with these practice projects? My recommendation is to make applications that are just for practice. They don't need to do anything real. Instead, they allow you to practice the specific thing you're learning. In this video, we're going to do a code review of just such a project. We'll look at how the code works, how it can be better, and how to make great practice projects. Now, if you don't know me, my name is Tim Corey, and it's my goal to make learning C# easier. I do this by providing videos here on YouTube multiple times per week. Plus, I have a weekly podcast. I also provide courses on C#, web development, and much more at IamTimCorey.com. The profits from those sales are what pays for the free content here on YouTube, so that everyone can have a great education in C#, not just those who can afford it. In this video, I am going to create a little bit of code, and if there's enough code to make it make sense, then I'll put a link down in the description so you can get that code as well. But I'll also link to the repository where this code can be found, the original code. All right, let's get started. So we're going to start with a project that Chris Woodward created. Now, he is learning C# right now actively and trying to understand how it all works. And so he created this really simple repository that was just some practice code that he created to try and figure out how to practice what he'd been learning so far. So what we're going to do is we're going to clone this code. So we'll go to copy right here for the HTTPS link, and then I will minimize it, and I'm going to come over here, and let's go into terminal, and we'll say git clone and paste in that URL. So now I have the files from that repository. I can open them up, and here's the first thing that happens. And part of this is just a quick, drag it into the repo to show it to others to show off. But you've got a folder in a folder, basically. So this is the repo folder name, read and write to a file experiment. But then inside there is read and write to a file experiment. And inside there is your solution. It's just ideal if you bump that up one level, but that's not a big deal. Let's open up Visual Studio and get started looking at this code. Now, like I said, remember that this is practice. So this is a new C# developer who is practicing what they learn. This is important to note because you shouldn't be expecting perfection here, and you shouldn't be expecting every bit of the code to be optimized. You should be expecting to see where they are trying out new things. So let's look at read and write to a file. The first thing I see right here is the solution name and the project name, first of all, are the same. I prefer to have different, actually, no, you know what? Okay, so the solution is a different name than the project. I like that. I like having a different name for the solution than the project. That way you don't get confused as to, is it the solution or the project? Especially since most solutions will end up having more than one project in them. Now, not for practice, but in real life. So that's the first thing I like, is to see those to be different. But the thing I don't like is to see spaces. As you can see, read and write to a file experiment, there are spaces in there, which does kind of work. So if we go back to the to Explorer here, you notice that there are spaces here, there are spaces in the file. So that does kind of work, but it's not ideal because when you go to reference those, let's right click on the project and go to properties. And let's look at, it's in here, default namespace. Notice it's read underscore and underscore write, because it changed the default namespace to be the name of the project. But when the project name has spaces in it, it can't match that up. And so it puts underscore. So now you have not a naming conflict, but different names. The file name has spaces. The namespace name doesn't have spaces. So it's generally recommended not to put spaces in your solution names or your project names. Instead, what I recommend is to crunch this together and make this a capitalized, and now you have what's called Pascal casing, where every word has a capital letter. That way you can easily read it. In fact, let's just change this real quick in the default namespace. So it would be read and write to a file. Notice you can still read it. It's still understandable, but yet this could match up with your project name very easily. Now you could go back and rename your project and your solution, but that's a bit of a harder thing to do, because while you can do that, then you have to go through and look at all your files to look at those namespaces as well, because those namespaces have to, or will need to match the new namespace you just created. It can get a little messy. You might have some artifacts along the way. You can definitely do it. It's just better if you do it up front. It's just easier for you. Okay, so let's look at the code in here. And this is, if we look, I believe it's a console application. Great. And it is a .NET 6 console application, which .NET 6 currently is the latest version of .NET. Excellent. Great place to practice. I highly recommend practicing in the console because it strips away all of the tinkering around with the UI in order to get to the place where you're ready to practice your code. So this allows you to practice with your code very, very quickly. So I really like the fact that we're in a console app. Let me open this up, and the one thing I notice right off the bat, I have glanced at this code. I have not gone in depth in this code, but I've glanced at this code, and I realized that this uses the old style of the namespace and class and static void main for our console application. This is a .NET 5 and previous style of console application. Totally fine. Definitely, especially if you're learning, it's nice to see what's kind of here, but it's also a bit of extra fluff around what you're actually practicing. So it's up to you if you want to use the new top level statements or not. Personally, I prefer to see them, or I'm sorry, I prefer to have top level only, which means I get rid of all of this. Notice that what it does, first of all, if we use top level, let's just create another project right next to this, just to kind of compare. So create a new project. We're going to create a console application once it comes up. We'll call this our read and write to a file update. Let's call it that, .NET 6. And what Chris, I believe, did was checked this box, do not use top-level statements. We're going to leave that box unchecked, which is the default, and we'll see the difference. There's the difference. This is what Chris would have seen when he started out his console application. The reason I like this, especially for practice, is the fact this is just demo code right here. We can start like this. Blank file, blank slate, just start typing C# code. As opposed to, we have our using statements, we have our namespace, we have our curly brace, we indent 4 spaces, and we have our program, and then we indent 4 more spaces, we have main, and now you're ready on line 16 to start coding. Actually, probably 14 because it looks like Chris put, or 13, Chris put some code comments in here. That's fine. That's great. But notice that we're this far, 12 spaces into the right side, moving right, before we start getting code. And we're, 13 lines at least down from the top. It's just a lot of extra, what really is boilerplate stuff. Now, again, when you're learning, understanding what static void main is and what a class program is and what a namespace is, that can be helpful. But just know that I think that it makes sense going forward to probably do something like this where you're just starting to write code. Okay. The other thing here is people really like to see class program and static void main, especially if you've been programming for a while. But really, this is not the same as a normal method. You don't ever call this. You never call static void main. I can't say never. 99.999% of the time, you don't call static void main. because of the fact it's called by the executable. It's the starting point, the entry point for your application. And we don't really mess around with the class program. So why do we have all this ceremony? I'm not sure, because this is definitely not standard compared to every other class and method. So there's some debate out there. That's fine. It's up to you. But I just want to point out that difference when it comes to writing, especially a practice project. Having a blank slate to just start coding in, I find just really focuses you in on what am I practicing. Okay, so let's look at what Chris was actually practicing. Let's shrink this down here. And let's look at code notes, which is excellent. And I have zoomed in text in order to see on the screen, so it goes off to the right-hand side. Normally, you'd want to keep your text all on one screen, but I'm guessing that Chris did. It's just that my screen is so zoomed in order to be visible on video. So I've got very large fonts. It's great for my eyes, but it isn't great for horizontal space, which doesn't help that we're going to start, in this case, 4 spaces in, now 8 spaces in, now 12 spaces in. But, okay, so let's look at the code first and come back to these comments. These comments kind of explain why he did what he did in the code. Okay, so we've got a initialized variable of text, and then we've got a path to what looks like a folder, and then we have a path to an actual text file, a full path. Okay, so obviously this will be unique to your PC. My user is not called admin, so I wouldn't have a C users admin desktop test. But it's up to you to modify that, but that works great. Also notice that we're using the this @ symbol here allows for string literals, which means that normally if Chris didn't have this, then these slashes right here, these backslashes, would cause errors. Because what they're trying to do is say the next character, escape that. It's not just a U, it's something special, but it's not. And so in order to put this path in here for your file path, this wouldn't work. And so you use the literal character, which says, hey, treat everything inside here as literally what it says it is. Okay, we can actually mix this with string interpolation if you wanted to. So we can actually still put something like this. Oops. Let's say text in there. But of course here text is not null. So let's just say that text equals like so. So you could put this in here, or there you go. And that would still work with string interpolation, even though this says, hey, this is a literal string. So it kind of cheats or lies because it is a literal string from things like escape characters, but it's not a literal string when it comes to the curly braces if you have string interpolation turned on. Just want to kind of point that out. Let's revert the code back to what it was. Okay, so we have 2 things here. We have a pathway and a text file. The only thing I would recommend here is if you have this kind of duplication. So you have the path here, and then you have the file which has the path in it. Maybe you think about doing something like interpolation, where you say, okay, we end with no slash. You can say right here, I can cut this out and put instead test pathway, and then use string interpolation, like so. And now this hasn't changed the value of test text file. It's still the same value because it's taking this content and putting it right here, actually right here, including the curly braces, so that we can still have that same path, but now we have the file at that location. So that's just something to point out that you could do to kind of, again, practice more working with strings and upgrading your skills there. And again, remember, the point of this application is not to do something. Maybe it does do something. That's not the point. The point is to practice what you're learning. Use your skills. So sometimes you might even use something that maybe you wouldn't use in production that way because you're practicing something new or trying something out. And that's perfectly fine. So this is just another opportunity to practice your string manipulation skills using a combination of your string literal and your string interpolation. Okay, next up we have a list of string that is customer info, which is instantiated to a new list. Great, excellent. This is not in all a criticism. Just so you know, though, there are other ways to instantiate the string. So you could say equals new, like that. That's a newer way of doing things. That works. Or you can also say var. So all three are valid ways of doing it. This way of doing things, for me personally, and this is just a personal thought. This is not something that has to be industry-wide or you have to do it this way. But my personal thought is when we say the same thing twice, do we need to? And I think personally, I don't want to. I don't want to say the same thing twice. So if I'm going to instantiate a list of string, what I do now is I get rid of that. And again, that's a newer thing in C#. I believe C# 9 or C# 10 allowed this. But what it's doing is saying, hey, I can assume what you mean when you say new because of the fact that you've already told me what the type is. Now, you can't do that with var because it doesn't know what the type is. But you can do the opposite and say var here because we're instantiating it to a specific type. It's up to you. Personally, I like to see on the left-hand side what the type is going to be because as I read through this code, I'll read through from left to right. So I know this is a list of string. Okay, customer is a list of string, and now we're instantiating it. So even if I don't see this again, I still know I'm instantiating. I already know that's a list of string. Okay, as opposed to saying var here, I have to say var customer info equals, okay, we're instantiating it to a new list of string. It's not a big difference. For my brain personally, again, this is a personal preference, I personally like to see the type on the left as opposed to the right because I feel it makes it easier for me to read through the code. But again, it's up to you. Just remember, code is meant to be read by humans, not computers, humans. Otherwise, we'd write in ones and zeros. So your code is going to be written or read by humans. And so you want to make it as readable as possible, as easy to scan through as possible. And that's why I personally remove the duplication here. But again, that's a personal preference. And it's something you could practice all three ways just to know how to do all three and get used to all three. So, cool. So now we have 4 variables instantiated. Now we start with if the directory does not exist, there's that not character, and we create the directory. Okay, so that's protecting against the potential that we're checking a directory that isn't there yet. Okay, that's good. So we want to make sure that we don't have a problem with our directory not existing when we try and check for it. That can throw an exception depending on which methods we use to look for a file. All right. The only thing I see here is, and again, this is a personal preference, the bang character, the exclamation point, this can be missed in certain circumstances. Now it's easier to see because they do change the color of it, which is nice. And this is a green name, I guess, in our code. But there are times when you have an interface next to this, so it has a capital I next to your exclamation point, and that could be less visible. So my personal preference is instead of saying not, I say equals false. But again, that's up to you if you want to go that far or not. It is only a personal preference. I just find, again, code is meant to be read by humans. I find this is easier to scan as opposed to what was there because I often see, oh, if it exists, then do this. And I go, oh, nope. If it doesn't exist. And so I missed that one small, thin character that changes the entire outcome of the if statement. It flips it. So I like to have a little bit more text there to show me, hey, we're looking for false here. Again, that's personal preference. Okay, so we're creating this directory. Cool. And then I don't get this. I don't think this is necessary. I don't know what's happening here is there's an append text right here that's appending. So we're appending text here to this file, which is our test or text.txt, and then closing it right away. I think this is what it's doing is creating an empty file. So we can test to make sure. It's been a while since I've played around with the file entries inside of C#, but that is something that I think is not necessary. But we're going to look at this. We're going to try and run it, see what it does, and see how it works and so on. So this is my kind of line. So I may learn something here. I may find out that, oh yeah, that's kind of necessary to have that file so that you don't have any problems. But I think this line can be eliminated, and we're going to go find out if that's true or not. Okay, so that's kind of one section. You kind of group that off. Cool. This is not something I do in production applications, but it's great for practice applications. So it kind of breaks apart your thoughts, and you can use comments like crazy in a practice application because the point is that you want to practice what you're learning, not that you want to create some type of perfectly written code application. All right, so now we have a console write line that says type anything and press enter. All right, so that's going to print out that line and it's going to go to the next line. Typically what I do when I'm asking a person for some type of input, what I will do is use the console write instead of the console write line. The difference is the cursor will stay at the very end. So what I would do is I would change this to a colon and I'd put a space here. And then I'd change this to console write. And the difference is that we have a cursor sitting right here, which then the cursor relates to this line of text as opposed to being on a blank line of its own. So it's up to you. It's a personal preference, but I think I've found that it makes users more comfortable knowing what they're doing if the instructions to the left of the line as opposed to the line above. But again, that's just a personal preference that I have found over the years. Okay, so we have the intro, hey, type anything and press enter. So then we have a try catch. This is a great time to practice try catch. In case you break something, you can catch the exception and see how that works. So excellent time to practice this. Let's actually skip down to the exception here. Catch exception E. The only thing that I would say here is traditionally, we say EX for the variable name. And the reason why is because when we have events, sometimes we pass the variable E along as part of the events. It's a personal thing. It's a preference thing. Typically, I just use EX. But again, you can use E. That is fine. That E will exist only in the context of this catch. So even if you had other things around it, it wouldn't step on toes unless you had a variable already named E, I believe. But this exception E is fine. We're going to write out the exception message. Great. So that's going to say just the message, not the stack trace or anything else. That's great. That's a great way of seeing the message. Now, it's not doing anything else with it. That's okay because this is a test application. We do have a finally here, and it says execute a finally block. This is not something that you would do normally in a quote unquote real application because it serves no purpose other than to say this is the finally block. However, This is an excellent thing to do in a practice application because when you're learning about the try-catch statement, you want to know, hey, when does the finally block execute? And does it execute every time or just if there is an exception or just when there's not an exception? Where does it execute if there is an exception? Does it execute before or after that exception? All that stuff you want to test out and make sure you understand. And so by putting this here, you will see every time the finally block is hit. That way you can see when it happens, what happens, and understand the flow of your try-catch finally much better. So I really like having this here in a practice application. All right, let's come back up here. We have a for each loop to start with. For int I equals -1. This is one that it's a creative way of doing things, but I think that's because there is a lack of understanding of all the different types of looping that we can do, and we'll see that in a minute. But it is creative, but typically we start at 0. So when you do something that's not typical, you can sometimes get into trouble. So I mentioned that because sometimes in programming, especially as you start to learn or even as you start to grow in programming, you start to get clever. And often when you're getting clever, you need to stop yourself and say, am I being too clever for my own good? Is there a better way of doing this? And I just stopped myself the other day from doing something clever because it was clever and it worked, but it was being a nightmare to try to maintain because I have to get back in the mindset of why did I do that clever thing? And so my options were to either document really well in code comments above why I did this clever thing, or do things a different way that maybe aren't as clever. Okay, so that's why I recommend just at least thinking through. Whenever you change a for loop's starter position, just make sure that you're doing it for the right reasons and there's not a better way. So we'll see if there's a better way in just a minute, but I just want to point this out. So we start at -1 and we go till I is less than, or while I is less than customer info.count. Well, customer info is up here. That's the list of string. Notice we instantiate it to a new list. We have not modified it since. So without modifying it again, this has 0 items. So if Chris started this loop at I equals 0, it would immediately exit out because there is nothing in the customer info.count. So that's why you start at -1, so you'd start at least once. And then we have the customer info.add and a console read line right inside of it. So this is where he's practicing capturing information and putting it into a list. 2 steps in one. That's great. That's fine. It is yelling at him because the fact that, this green squiggly, because the fact that console.readline returns a nullable string, and this is not a nullable list. So you could say this is strings are nullable. And if you do that, you have to do it over here too. That's another reason why it's nice to have only one side. But then it wouldn't yell at him anymore because it says, hey, you can accept null as one of the options for your entries. So just note that's why that's there. In this case, I would not recommend, I don't think, for this particular case, I don't think that null is the right option here. So let's leave it as not nullable. But he's adding it right to customer info. And then if customer info.count is greater than or equal to 10, break. Okay, so that's his for loop. He does have an explanation up here. I'm aware that breaking a 10 or probably at 10 entries in the for loop defeats the purpose, and I should have used an array. I want to learn how to break using Control Shift plus another key or something if it's possible. Okay, so I'm not sure how you'd break. I understand. So he wants to learn how to stop the for loop in some other way besides just saying, hey, I want to stop at 10 entries. Okay, so right now he has said, hey, if it's 10 entries, stop. Otherwise, just keep going. But there's other ways of doing this, and that's why I said that I think that that maybe he's just not yet to the point where he's learned the other loops in C#, and that's totally fine. You have to learn it. It's over time and at a certain pace, and you need to practice your for loops as well. So this is a great time to practice for loops, and we can talk more about how to make this better, even just using a for loop in a minute. I'll actually rewrite that in just a minute. But let's go on to the for each loop. So we have a for loop that is going to read what the user types over and over again for 10 lines. And that's going to break. Now down here, we have a for each loop prints each entry in the console and puts it in the text file. So it's going to kind of print it right back out. You might say, well, Tim, what's the point? We're just reading in and writing it out. Absolutely, that's what you're doing. You're practicing, though. Let's start at the beginning. You're practicing your variables. You're practicing instantiating lists. You're practicing a couple things with files and directories in consoles, and the try catch and the try catch finally, the for loop, the for each loop, breaking a loop, adding an entry to a list. Like the list of things that has been practiced here are quite large. In fact, I would recommend that as you're learning C#, you don't create something even this complex until you have learned multiple things. And obviously Chris has. So Chris has learned multiple things. Now he's kind of trying to put everything together into one application to practice not just how each thing works, but how it works together. So he's practicing how a for loop works and how to break that in conjunction with how a list works and adding to a list. And he kind of wants to learn how to also break this in another way besides just the counter. He's also practicing the for each loop on a generic list and how to write to a file and how to do that effectively, how to write to the console and so on. So there's a lot of things going on here all at once for practice. So this is kind of what I would call a next level of practice project. It only has, even all the code comments and the fact that it's not top level files, even so, it's only 89 lines of text. So this is really not a lot of work, and yet he's practiced multiple things in conjunction with each other. So when it comes to practice projects, your practice projects can be really small. They can be tiny. They just have to practice whatever you've learned. They don't have to do something real or effective or something you sell to somebody else. It just has to practice what topic you're learning. Okay, so for each, this prints to the console, which of course he actually has commented out, but it would print to the console if this was not commented out. Then we have this open a file in append mode. So this is going to open the file with rewrite access with no sharing and a specific path. So we have our text file we're opening, and we're opening it in append mode. And then what he's saying here, and notice here we have a using statement. And what this does is actually something that I think that I'm not sure if Chris understands exactly how this works, which is, again, totally fine as you're learning. But this right here, what it does is it says that when we're done with whatever scope we're in this case, I believe it will close it out at the end of the for each. So at the end of the for each, because that's the scope it's created in, it's going to close out of the file. And again, using the writer, it's going to close a stream writer as well at the end of the file, which means you don't have to do this because it's already being done right here. So this using statement right here, this is a really cool and powerful thing to learn about. It's not the same as up here. That's different. This just shortens names is all it does. But down here, what the using does is it uses the interface that Microsoft has provided, the iDisposable interface. If you put that on any type of class that you create, when that allows you to use this using statement. And what will happen then is at the end of the scope that you're in, it will close out running the dispose method in your class. It will dispose of anything that's open. So you can dispose of a stream. If you open a stream, you can dispose of a connection to a database or whatever else. It's a really useful tool that Microsoft provides. It's an interface with one method in it. So this is Microsoft stuff that uses the iDisposable, but you can as well. You should as well in certain circumstances. So we're opening a file here. We're opening a stream. We're writing the customer, which is the single entry from that list, into the writer, and then we close out the writer. Now again, if there wasn't a using here, we should also do the file.close. But because of the fact that they're both using statements, we don't even have to do the writer. So we could comment this out as unnecessary. But there is one other thing to think through when you are using loops. Whenever you're using a loop, you need to think through, what am I creating inside the loop? And could I do it outside the loop in order to make things more efficient? So in this case, there is a connection to a file, and there is a stream writer that are being created every time we loop through this. And as you saw earlier, it will be 10 entries. So 10 times we're opening the file, we're creating a stream writer, we're writing a line, and we're closing. Now, there are ways of doing things more efficiently. So what we could do is we could move these two things outside of the for each, and of course comment this out. And now this would still work, and this would write each line, but now we're not opening the file every time and create a new stream writer every time. So I'm going to undo this. We're going to go through and kind of rebuild this just to kind of show off what I would do to make this even more efficient as an application. But again, remember, we're focusing here on practicing C#, not making the most efficient application. So with this, that's one of the things I look for. Whenever I'm in a for each loop, try not to do things that are going to create new memory consumers and then dispose of them and create them and dispose of them and create, dispose, because it really can cause your application to use a lot more memory until it cleans it up. It also can put more strain on, say, your system resources. So if possible, in this case, it is possible, move us out of the for each and do it once, and then just do this multiple times. Just write the lines multiple times. Now, if you did move the using statements outside of for each, then their scope is now inside of the try. Actually, I take that back. So the try catch, if you, I'm trying to think. I believe it lives inside of scope, but you might have access to it outside of scope. So you have to check on that to make sure that this variable goes away after the end of the try. So we could look at that to see if that lives outside, because if it does, then it would live to the end of the application as opposed to the end of the try. But I believe it would live inside. No, I'm not convinced of that. We'll have to look at that. I don't know everything. We'd have to test it out. Okay, so I would make some tweaks here, but also note that there is other ways of writing to a file. And we're going to see that in a minute, but file dot write all lines. Write all lines, you give the path and you give the contents, which notice is a string array. But if we give it the path, which I believe is it test, test file. Test text file, because that includes the path. And then customer info. Even though customer info is not an array, it's a list, because the fact that lists can be treated like arrays, it says, hey, you know what? I can use an IEnumerable as well That's one of the overloads. So a list is an IEnumerable. So a list is an implementation of IEnumerable. An IEnumerable is an interface. So if you haven't learned about interfaces and implementations yet, I have a video on that on this channel, but that's why we can use a list here. So that right there would replace all of this, unless, of course, you want to do the write all lines, but you can just have that one line in your for each. So again, we'll work on optimizing this just to show off other things you could do. But again, this is not about optimizing code. It's about talking through what's good and what needs to be improved a little bit as you practice. Okay, we talked about the catch, and finally, let's come down here. Console write line. Let's read your list in the file. So again, this is about practice. And so he's practicing writing to a file, create a file, writing to a file, and now he's practicing reading from a file. And he has a great file to read from because he's just written to one. Okay, this is how you read the text in a text file and print it to the console. This part is confusing. Okay, so that's actually a really good code comment to have as you're practicing, to say, hey, this is where I'm struggling, because then you can come back to it later and go, yeah, how do I do that? And maybe you've learned more, you know how to do it now, or maybe it's a great place, kind of a bookmark to come back to later and go, let's figure that out. Now, one of the things you can do that's part of Visual Studio is you can say to do, figure this out. Okay, now this right here, the to do is a special keyword, and this allows you to create a list, a to-do list of things that you need to do. And if you want to see your to-do list, you can go to View, and it's Task List down here, which is right here. Notice it says to do, figure this out. So if I was somewhere else, let's say I'm over here. I go to Task List and go, oh, I have a to-do to figure this out. I can double click on it and go right to it. So that's the only thing I would upgrade about this is say, hey, let's make a to-do, and that is a keyword, all caps to do. And then you say, give a space, and then whatever you want to put afterwards. I put a dash and another space with my message. But that allows you to flag things in code comments that you want to come back to later. There's also a few others. Hack is one, so that will show up. There you go. That'll show up like that. There is, there's at least one more. You can also add your own if you want. I only use to-dos. That's just, that's all I do. But what happens is when you get a big code base, you have a lot of stuff going on. You might forget to do something, but you kind of have to do three things at once. You only do one, of course, at once. But then the other two, one of them might get forgotten. So I put a to-do in each of them that says, hey, let's go ahead and come back and address this. And I can leave myself a note while I remember so that it's fresh in my mind what that message is. And then later, when I've forgotten about it, and I come back to it, the note helps explain to me what exactly I need to figure out. So this part is confusing. So the goal here is to read from the file. So he says store file.read all text file in the variable text. All right, that's what he did. Then console.writeLine text, not the pathway. All right, that's his little note to himself to say, hey, make sure you write out the text in the text file, not the path to the text file. And this is where naming is important and naming is hard. Because when you call things text file, is that text file? Does that mean that it's the text of the text file, or is it the file name of the text file that you have text in? And so, yeah, you have to think through. Now, of course, this is a practice project, but again, practice projects are also great times to practice good naming because you start to see the pitfalls of naming things certain ways. For example, text file. You're like, first of all, it's redundant, text file. But then, second of all, does that mean it's the text of the text file? And you start to question yourself and say, that's confusing. So let's make sure that you name things better so that they are more clear, and practice it now so that later you will have those lessons in the back of your mind when you actually create variables. It's not the first time you create a variable with a certain naming convention or structure, so that you have kind of experienced some of those things that cause problems or confusion. Okay, so this confusion, I think some of it comes from the naming. And again, why do employers, this is a little aside here, but why do employers ask for work experience? Because of things like this. Because when you have not been doing it for real, then you don't learn the lesson. So if you just said A, B, C, D for your variable names, or text and text file and so on, you don't get as much value out of that when it comes to the real world. When you start to create variable names for real, that's the first time you've created one for real. You've always just used throwaway variable names. But if you treat it right, you start to get experience with saying, wait, that's confusing how this is named. I have to not confuse the variable text, not the pathway. So I have to make sure that I leave notes here so I know which variable does what, because it's confusing. When you start to get that experience, then you say, hey, I know that I should be more cognizant of the things that could be interpreted here. So I need to make sure I name my variables well right at the very beginning. So instead of saying text, maybe I say something a little differently here. Instead of saying test text file, which, by the way, down here, okay, it's test text file. It's not text file, it's test text file. Again, some confusion there. But I'll leave it back where it was. But with that experience of knowing that these variable names cause confusion, you start to put that in your brain and say, I need to create good variables. That experience allows you to create better names the first time, more often, when you start building real applications. That's why employers want work experience, because you've worked out those bugs. You've worked out the bugs of going from your practice projects where you just kind of create throwaway names to real projects. But if you treat your practice projects like real projects as much as possible without going overboard, but if you treat them that way, then you get better experience, which means you'll be better prepared for the role, even if you don't have the work experience that they might require. You might be able to still get the job because of the fact that you have created or generated your own work experience by doing things as much the right way as possible. So again, I've said up here that, hey, I wouldn't do everything the same way in production, but this is great for testing. That's excellent. But there's also something said for whenever possible, do things the right way, and variable namings is one of those. Okay, so down here, text includes the file.readAllText method. I'm not sure what that means. It doesn't include the text variable does not store the method itself. It stores the results of the method. So when we run file.readAllText, it gives you back an output. Notice here it's a string output. So that's what we're storing in the text variable. So I'm not quite sure what that code comment line is saying, but it's storing the output of that method. And if you don't do it this, if you don't do it this way, it will print the pathway C:\\\. Okay, so I think, again, there is that confusion about printing the file name as opposed to the file contents here. So, but this will print the file contents. And notice that we're getting back one big lump sum of all the text. Read all text gives you back a string that is all of the text, and you just print it once. What I would usually prefer to see here is, I would say, list of string or string array. let's do a string array. It's easier. String array of file lines. See that naming right there? You read that and go, oh, it's the lines of the file. So it more easily associates what the variable holds because the naming is a little better. Okay, equals file dot read all lines. Okay, and then you pass in that test text file. So instead of read all text, which yes, that is going to read all the text, but returns a string, we can read all the lines of text and put that into a string array. Why is that valuable? Well, we can do a for each and say string line in lines, file lines, and say console write line, line. All right, so you can write through each line, or we can enumerate them and do for I equals 0, I is less than file lines, I plus plus, and we'll say console write line, file line at position I. Now, file lines is not null here. Yeah, I know it's not null here. Oh, file lines.length, sorry. I'm staring at this like, this does work. But you have to give the length. So what this does is it loops through and prints every line one at a time. So it will end up looking similar to this, but the difference is I can look at or evaluate one line at a time. So it's up to you if you want to do just one big, blob of text, or if you want to be able to treat every line as individual so that maybe you process every line differently or whatever. In this case, if you just want to print out all the text files to the console, this works perfectly. I just want to point out the alternative. Okay, that's the application. So let's go and create our own version of this. So the basics of the application. Let's go to the top here. The basics are we want to have a text file. We want to make sure that it exists, and we want to ask or fill that text file in with user input. And then we want to write that input to the text file. And then we want to read that back out to the console. Okay, so let's put some code comments here. We want to create a text file. We want to get input from the users, one per line, something like that. And they want to write all lines to the text file. And they want to read all lines from the text file. Not cheating. We want to actually practice this. And they want to print out each line to the console. Okay, something like that. That's our goal of what we want to do. Now, what we'll do is we're going to grab, let's go back to the temp folder. We're going to just put our file right in the temp folder. Okay, so let's put our stuff right here. So we're going to say string file name is going to be, let's do file name and path. And we'll do that same string literal. I'll put my semicolon at the end, come back. And we're going to say C:\temp/ file demo file.txt. That works. So we have our file name, and then we're going to come back to actually working this file. But for right now, let's get the input from the user. So I want to ask the user for their entries. So let's first create our list of string, and we're going to say, let's call this our user input equals new, like so. So that I'm creating the variable right where I need it as opposed to everything at the top. Is this a big deal difference? Not usually, okay? But when we create the variable, if we create it closer to when it's used, then it is in memory for less time. Now, again, it's actually as if they're side by side because these code comments don't count. So in this case, it would be, a moot point. But in the case where you have 10,000 lines of code and you declare your variables at the top versus where you need them, that can make an impact in how much memory your application uses. And knowing what those variables are for is also impactful if they're near where they're used as opposed to declared at the top. This is a kind of a break from if you used a JavaScript, or at least old school JavaScript, where you had var and then the variable name. Well, JavaScript would hoist up that variable and put it at the top, regardless of if you declared it later on or not. But it would just put the variable, not the assigned value there. That's changed now with let and const. That's not how it works anymore. So there's not the hoisting unless you use var. But that's just, if you're coming from a JavaScript background, it's a little different. So, all right. So we have our list of string for user input, and we're going to say we wanted to ask the user for some type of text to give us. All right. So I'm going to have a single user input. I'm going to start off with equals string.empty. Okay, so it has nothing in it, but it's not null. And we've got this single user input, and I'm going to do a do loop. Now, again, if you're not familiar with do loops yet, then you would want to use the for loop that you know. But I'm going to teach the do loop, and we'll maybe come back later and do the for loop if you didn't do a do loop. But I'm going to say do while single user input. I have some options here. I could say length is greater than 0. So if you say, hey, in your entry message, you say type your message or hit enter to exit the loop. That would be user input length of 0. You could also say if they type a certain character like Q for quit, or do you want to enter another thing, yes or no? But I think we'll use the length is 0. And a do loop, it's going to execute this once, at least once. And then it's going to evaluate if it should continue executing. But it's always going to execute once. This is opposed to a while loop that starts off up here with while and the condition and then the curly braces. Because in a while loop, you can execute 0 or more times. We want to execute at least once because we don't know what the user input is. We don't want to get cute and try to fake something. We're going to use the tools that are provided to us. So we're going to say console.write, please enter your message. Let's shorten this. Enter message or return for to quit. Colon space. Okay, and then we're going to say single user input equals console.readline. And we're going to capture that value. And then we have the option here of, I think what I will do is I'm going to say, I'm going to try not to get cute here. So I'm going to say if single user input dot length is greater than 0, which notice I got this comparison twice now. It's going to have to be. So I'm going to say, in this case, user input dot add single user input. So if you don't just hit enter, then I want to add that to the list. But if you do just hit enter, I don't want to put a blank line in a list. That doesn't make sense. That's kind of messy. The other way I could do this would be that After this is all done, I would remove the last line. But that's ugly. I don't like doing that. Let's not do that. Now, it's yelling at me here because this is a nullable, potentially nullable value. So let's actually say that, yes, string can be null. But then the length, I can't check the length of a null value. Now, what I can do here, I can put the question mark. And what this does, it says, hey, if this is null, then this is false. So therefore, don't even evaluate any further, just exit out of the if statement. So the other thing I could do is I could do a other option here would be the string is null or white space and single user input, like so. That would also be another way of evaluating it. You say if it's false, like that. That could also be put inside of here instead, but this works. We just do the same thing down here. If it's if it is null, we're going to exit out of the while. If the length equals 0, we'll exit out of the while. But if it's not null and the length is greater than 0, we go back to the top of this curly brace and run it all over again. So we're going to ask the user every time, enter your message or return to quit. We're not going to leave them hanging and just have this blinking cursor there that they're not quite sure what to do with. We're going to allow them to see exactly what to do in every single entry. Okay, so that's going to give us our list of users. Now, or list of messages. Now, normally I'd test this, but we're running long, so I'm not going to test this yet. I'm going to test at the end. But I encourage you, when you are practicing, test as soon as possible. Now, there's no output, so I'd start putting breakpoints in. And after you go through the do loops, you notice the breakpoints at the end. I would test to see what's in user input. And I would test again to see if you can exit out of the loop and so on. So now we're going to write all lines to the text file. So we have file.write all lines. And we have our, notice I can just hit tab because IntelliCode fills it in for me. I have Copilot installed, but I'm not using that yet. But file.write all lines, I pass in the path to our file, including the file name, and then an array of the contents, which I have as a list, but it says to array is the way to convert a list back to an array. So that will write all lines, just one line, and then I can read all lines from that same text file. So let's say string array. I'm going to say, we call this one up here the user input. We're going to call this the text file lines equals file.read all lines and the path. So that's what we do there. And then we're going to print this out, and we would say, let's do a for each. And we'll say string line in text file lines. Oops. Console write line, line. Like so. That should be all we need, but let's test it because what Chris did was up here, he did create that empty file number, and we went, do we need to do that? Let's find out. So the way to find out is to test it. So right click on my new project and say set as startup project, and let's run this. Okay, enter message. Hello world. Hi, yo, goodbye. And I hit enter to quit. And it prints out hello world, hi, yo, and goodbye. And it has created this demo file.txt with those 4 entries. Okay, so that's our file that got created. And that's how we read and wrote to it and then read from it. And we didn't have to do that check because of the fact we were doing the write all lines, which I believe creates a new file, and then closes it. Now, if we run this again, and I say testing, hit enter, and enter again, it says testing. If we open this up, it says testing. What happened to hello world, hi, yo, and goodbye? Well, it got overwritten because the write all lines creates a new file every time. And so if the file already exists, it's going to delete it and create a new one. So that might be something to think through as well. You might want to do a check for if the file exists. And if it does, what you could do is you could read from the file and say, put those values into user input. And then what you'd be doing is essentially appending. You'd start with the file already has and add more things. Now, I'm going to go on memory here and see if I can get this done. But if file.exists, and we're going to look for file name and path. If file exists, then, and notice this returns a Boolean. So I'll leave it alone. If I wanted to say does not exist, I would say equals false. But since it exists, if file exists, then do this. Then I am going to say that user input equals file dot read all lines of the file name and path, but that returns an array. Notice returns a string array. That's not going to work, but I can say to list, like so. Now, here's the one thing that that would be tricky here is this is going to overwrite the list that's already there, but we've already instantiated it once. What this is going to do is actually, if a file already exists, it's going to destroy what we've already created. It might be beneficial at that point to not instantiate it yet, but put an else statement here. And then we're going to say user input equals new, like so. Or new list of string if you wanted to spell it out now because of the fact that it's not specified right in line. But that way, either way it gets instantiated, but now if it already exists, we'll start with that. So remember we have this file here, it says testing. Let's run this again. And we're going to say hello world and enter. Notice it says testing in hello world now. And if we open that file up, it says testing hello world. And if I closed that out. Oh well, but if I were to do that again, then I could have a bigger and bigger file every time. I just add to it. So that's one more thing you could do. The do loop here, if you didn't want to do a do loop, let's look at what a for loop might look like instead. So I'll put it down here. We'll comment out the for loop. But for I equals 0, and then we can do, we'll say well, I mean, we're going to force this to work, but this is not great code. I can say I is less than 1, and then change this to minus, which actually what it's going to do is going to decrement I, which means I goes 0, -1, -2, which will always be less than 1, therefore will always work. And then we could put our code in here, like so. And then on our, if length greater than 0, we add the input and we do an else here and say break. That's an abuse of the for loop, but it would technically work. Just so you know, again, this is clever code. It's not using the code for what it's meant to use it for. We'll figure out a better way of doing this, which again is the do while loop will be the better way of doing that. But just you could force it to do that, but I wouldn't do that. Okay. In fact, That's so embarrassing of bad code. I'm going to get rid of it. Take a screenshot if you really want to see that, but don't do this in real life. Okay. If you wanted to practice the for each loop still, then what I would, the for loop, then what I would do is come down here and do for I equals 0, I is less than text file lines dot length, and then do console write line of text file lines of I, and I'd comment out, I'd comment out this one like so. So this is how you practice the for loop in the way it's correctly being used. I know you might want to practice the break, and that's, again, something you could do. But in that case, what I would do is I would say, if we could say text file lines I to lowercase, to lower, equals hello world. Whoops. Then break. Okay. And then what you're doing is checking your text file entry to say, hey, is that equal to hello world? I did to lower so you could have different casing, but you could take this off if you wanted to. But then you need to make sure that everything lines up exactly correct. And there are probably better ways of doing string comparisons than just double equals, but that would work for you to test the break and to see it break early as opposed to showing off everything. So that might be a way of doing that as well. But again, make sure you practice things in a way that makes sense and aren't just being abuse of the functionality. So that doesn't abuse the functionality. The way above that was quite embarrassing does abuse the functionality and probably shouldn't be done. Okay, so that's my code review of this code. I would encourage you, to whoever's listening, not just Chris, but to whoever's listening, I would encourage you to practice like this. Create projects that don't really do anything. They don't have massive value. Instead, what they have is massive value for practice, where you start to do things and go, down here, this was confusing. That right there is gold. When you start looking at tutorials and you go, yeah, I know what I'm doing, and then you actually do it and go, wait, I'm confused. That's perfect, because that's when you know that you're starting to really learn the topic, because before you thought you knew it, but when you start to actually do it, you go, whoa, something doesn't add up. And you expose an assumption you have, or you figure out that things don't work the way you thought they did, or maybe you just have typos you need to fix, or maybe you have variable names that just need to be better. Whatever the case may be, you learn something new. And that's what practice does, is practice really exposes what you missed or didn't understand that you thought you understood. And it really solidifies in your mind how to do these things. So I would definitely encourage you to practice this way. This is an excellent way to practice. When I saw this repo, first of all, I like being able to help people, and Chris wanted a code review, and so I was able to do that. But also, I wanted everyone to see this is how you practice, because this is a great example of practicing what you're learning and really not just being satisfied with, I've watched something, therefore I must know it. Because no, you don't. You got to actually do it. All right. So I encourage you, follow this pattern as well. If you have questions, leave them down in the in the comments down below in YouTube. Or if you want a suggestion for a future video or maybe a future code review, leave that over at suggestions.imtimcorey.com. I love to hear your suggestions, and hopefully you'll see your suggestion in a new episode at I Am Tim Corey. Thanks for watching, and as always, I am Tim Corey.